Chapter 3. Off to Hawaii. California, here we come. Everyone returned, and most were sad that their leave was over, but there was real excitement about the prospect of finally shipping out, going overseas. The orders from Commander Fleet Air Force's Atlantic were for the squadron to report to Commander Fleet Air Wing 2, U.S. Fleet, at the Naval Air Station at Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii, for further assignment. The squadron's movement west took place in two phases. First, we went from Harvey Point to the Naval Air Station to Alameda, California. The movement of the aircraft was made in 3 increments of 5 planes each. The first 5 planes departed Harvey Point on June 16. The route was overland via Eagle Mountain Lake, Texas, near Fort Worth, then to Naval Air Station North Island to San Diego, and then on to Alameda. The other 2 5-plane increments departed June 17 and June 18. 51 officers and 111 enlisted men flew the 15 planes across country, and the remaining 55 enlisted men, I was one of them, traveled to the West Coast by train under the command of Ensigns Milmar and Bolding. The train trip, although lengthy, was not too uncomfortable as Pullman cars were available instead of the usual troop train accommodations. Our first stop of any consequence was in New Orleans, where we had a 7 to 8 hour layover. We took off from the train and fortunately met some young ladies who acquainted us with some of the joys of the Big Easy. When the train pulled out, several young ladies got on the train with us and rode in the compartments at the end of the cars all the way to California. The plane trip from East Coast to West Coast was a difficult one at best. The route was almost all over land and mountains. We were routed over every possible body of water, but the downside was still that potential emergency landing places were minimal. This was a factor in the loss of a number of planes and their crews as various squadrons made their way west. Fortunately, all of our planes made it safely. Some unusual calling cards were distributed from North Carolina to Eagle Mountain Lake, Texas, by Crew 4. It seems they had conned a case of toilet paper from the supply room at Harvey Point. They then proceeded to periodically toss an occasional roll out into the atmosphere en route to Texas. It must have been a sight to look up and see a streamer of toilet paper falling down in your front yard. While flying the leg from Harvey Point to Eagle Mountain Lake, Crew 6 had an interesting experience as related by radioman Chad Alger. I noted in my logbook that on June 16, 1944, we left Harvey Point en route to Hawaii and points beyond. The first leg of the flight to the West Coast and NAS Alameda was via Eagle Mountain Lake, Texas. When we landed at Eagle Mountain Lake, it was obvious that our engines weren't quite right, and the mechanics there informed us that evidently the mechanics at Harvey Point, who had overhauled the engines, had installed the exhaust stacks for the bottom cylinders the wrong way. They told us if you had flown much further, you would have had a disaster. They worked on the plane all night to correct the problem, and we were able to continue on to San Diego the next day and to Alameda the following day. Alameda, California. All 15 of the squadron's planes arrived in Alameda by June 20th without further incident, and the train contingent arrived on the 21st. For the next few days, each of the planes would get a thorough inspection, mechanical check, and would be stripped of all excess weight, such as guns and armor, in preparation for the long overwater flight to Hawaii. So everyone enjoyed 4 or 5 days of little real work while the planes were being prepared for the long flight ahead. The San Francisco area was the perfect liberty town. Like so many servicemen who passed through San Francisco, many of us fell in love with the city by the bay at first sight. To this day, it is one of my most favorite spots, and I've made many business and pleasure trips there over the ensuing years. Although not as mystical as it was then, it still is one of the great towns of the world. Several of us, including J.P. Williams and myself, were sent on a working party one day to Vernalis, an outlying airstrip, to work with some SB-2C dive bombers who were practicing carrier landings. That evening in nearby Modesto, California, Williams and I came across 2 young ladies, and we spent a few nice hours together. The next night, which was our last night before shipping out to Hawaii, we returned to Modesto, and I got heavily into some tequila. On the way home, I fell asleep on the Navy bus, which ended up I know not where. Fortunately, a sympathetic shore patrolman listened to my story about having to ship out and arranged a jeep ride for me back to Alameda so that I wouldn't miss my ship. Missing one ship was a criminal offense, so I was most grateful. Underway to Hawaii. Sadly, our pleasant stay had to end, and on June 24th, the first 3 of our planes took off shortly before sunset for the Naval Air Station at Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii. All flights were made at night. The average flight time was 14 to 16 hours, depending upon the prevailing winds. Commander Fleet Air Wing West Coast had established regulations that the planes would fly to Hawaii with a crew consisting of the pilots and 4 aircrewmen, 2 machinist mates and 2 radiomen. The remaining aircrew, including myself, would travel to Pearl Harbor aboard the USS Barnes, an escort aircraft carrier. Ensign Bob Haig, one of the ground crew officers, sailed with us as officer in charge. It was exciting but also sad as we sailed from Alameda and out through the Golden Gate. I remember a lot of young ladies waving to us as we passed under the bridge. As the bridge faded in the distance, it occurred to me that this was real. We were off to the war, and who knew what might happen. We were convoyed out of the harbor by a blimp, which stayed with us most of the first day. Then we were in the company of some other ships, as I recall. This was the first shipboard experience for many of us, not very pleasant. There were hundreds of passengers, plus a full load of aircraft being ferried to the islands. You could hardly move around. I remember that the mess hall was open around the clock, and we ate in shifts at different times each day. Sleeping facilities could best be described as steerage. We even had to wait in line to go to the head. There was a unique odor to the ship, all the usual smell of food, the results of some seasickness, many unwashed bodies, compounded by little ventilation, made it rather unpleasant. This is the first time I heard the derisive term Airedale used. It was a term used by shipboard sailors to denigrate those of us who flew and collected flight pay. It was as though we were the chosen ones and not their world. I had heard that there were really 2 navies, distinguished semantically by the shoes officers could wear. The black shoes were the shipboard sailors, and the brown shoes the aviators. So even though we enlisted flying personnel did not wear brown shoes, we were still thought of as different. We were Airedales. It was interesting that I felt queasy on this pretty good-sized ship, but never had been airsick. I spent a good deal of time during our crossing out in the fresh air on the flight deck. I guess I wasn't cut out to be a shipboard sailor. Also, by hiding out, I avoided duty as a mess cook, and I'm not sure that I could have handled that with the ship rolling in the swells. Midnight small stores, or kumshaw. There was in every Navy unit some individual who was an expert at scrounging needed things. The technique employed was called midnight small stores, or kumshaw, a nice way of saying stealing. Samuel Hines, in his book Flights of Passage, describes kumshaw as anything left untendered was available. And in a world where everything belonged to the government, nothing belonged to anybody, and therefore. One of the ultimate examples of this I ever saw was just prior to the Barnes leaving the pier at Alameda. An officer had just driven onto the pier in an apparently new Jeep and parked it right by the Barnes. The officer then left for some errand. It wasn't long before a crane appeared out of the hatch to the hangar deck, lifted the Jeep on board. I'm sure the officer had some explaining to do about the Jeep that disappeared into thin air. Pearl Harbor. We arrived in Pearl Harbor after an uneventful 5-day trip. The only things most of us knew about Hawaii before the war were pineapples and hula dancers. The first sight of Pearl Harbor was overwhelming, with dozens of ships of all types, and many of the scars of December 7th still present. A whole new world suddenly opened up with Pearl Harbor, and several thoughts crossed my mind. First, when I was 8 or 10 years old, we vacationed at Virginia Beach, Virginia, and my father arranged a visit aboard the USS Langley, the Navy's first aircraft carrier. It was fascinating, and I have never forgotten that thrill. My second thought was recalling the effects of the destruction that was still apparent and realizing that the war was real. The war was an unknown but exciting and adventurous prospect, and I think seeing Pearl Harbor whetted our appetites. As I wrote this chronicle, I recalled the book Wings of War from the Naval Institute Press. In this book, Brigadier General William Mitchell, Assistant Chief, U.S. Army Air Service, was quoted as having said on October 24, 1924, "I am convinced that the growing air power of Japan will be the decisive element in the mastery of the Pacific. Air operations for the destruction of Pearl Harbor will be undertaken. Aeronautical siege will then be inaugurated against all the Hawaiian Islands, and all vessels approaching will be attacked through the air or under the water. The air attack to be made on Ford's Island at 7:30 a.m. Route to be direct. The Philippines will be attacked in the same manner." Probably never before in the history of warfare was an event more anticipated and yet of greater surprise than the attack on Pearl Harbor. In a sense, it was a comedy of errors, costly but still full of blunders, like many incidents in a war. For example, from 1931 on, the graduates of the Japanese Naval Academy faced one of the same questions on their final exam. How would you carry out a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor? Then late in 1941, the U.S. intelligence community was able to crack the purple, which was Japan's loosely guarded diplomatic code. So now U.S. intelligence analysts could read the secret communications between Tokyo and its diplomats. The Pearl Harbor attack force sailed from Japanese waters on November 26, 1941, and a purple message from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. was intercepted, stating, "In 2 or 3 days, negotiations will be de facto ruptured." Negotiations were ongoing during this period between the U.S. and Japan and continued even after the attack was launched at 7:30 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th. I've been to Hawaii several times since the war, and as most people who remember the attack on that fateful Sunday, I still feel a certain closeness and sadness with the place and what it meant to so many lives. Kaneohe Bay, Oahu, Hawaii. Off the ship in Pearl Harbor and onto buses for the trip to Kaneohe Naval Air Station, over the high cliffs through the pass called Nuanu Pali, along the only road across the island into Kaneohe. The air station was located on the southeastern coast of the island of Oahu. Finally, the whole squadron was together at Kaneohe. There had been a few mechanical and navigational problems, but by July 4, all 15 planes had made the 2,400-mile transit. This flight was the first indication of the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, where we would operate for the next year. The Pacific is so large, covering 1/3 of the world's surface and totaling 64 million square miles and holding 30,000 islands. It is divided into North and South Pacific by the equator. Our operations were to be in the North Pacific from the Marshall Islands west to the Philippines and north to Japan, China, and Korea. The air station was a beehive activity inasmuch as all patrol squadrons, both sea and land-based, and a variety of other types of squadrons passed through The air station was a beehive activity inasmuch as all patrol squadrons, both sea and land-based, and a variety of other types of squadrons passed through when heading west into the combat zone, or returning after a tour of duty heading back to the States. Buoy watch. On July 5th, I stood my first buoy watch. As I recall, it was with Ensign Casey, Harry Gardner, Frank Thompson, and Frank Reddy. We were drinking coffee and listening to the radio when Tokyo Rose, the infamous propagandist broadcasting from Japan, came on with her regular program. After some music, she welcomed VP-21 to the Pacific. To hear her welcome us was sort of a shock, but it seemed to be standard practice for her to announce what was going on in the Pacific War. She had an inventory of great jazz and popular songs. The scuttlebutt was when the B-29 started bombing Japan, they parachuted cartons of new records for her to play. This was the beginning of our buoy watch system that required all planes at a buoy to always be manned by a partial crew, usually one pilot, 2 mechanics, 1 radioman, and 1 ordnanceman, in order to move the plane if necessary. Buoy watch had really become a way of life, as only Eniwetok and Saipan of the forward areas we would operate in had any seaplane facilities ashore. This meant, in addition to actual flight time, crews would spend half their remaining time on buoy watch. Life on the base. In Blue Catalinas of the World War II, Mills describes Kaneohe Naval Air Station. Kaneohe Naval Air Station had excellent living conditions as well as a base for operations and training. The bay with its beautiful many-colored coral formations made a sheltered runway base to the west of the land-based airfield. The runways of the airfield were long and wide, and the prevailing trade winds were favorable for takeoff and landing. The air station personnel housing, industrial buildings, grounds, and other developed facilities were very nice. It was also a beautiful place, the hills covered with gorgeous flowers of every conceivable color. The water in the bay was a beautiful blue-green, typical of all the island atolls we were to visit later. Kaneohe was a paradise to those of us who had never been in the tropics, with warm breezes, palm trees, and sunshine every day. It was unlike any place I'd ever seen. The barracks were of concrete construction and cool, and above all, they were clean. The only downer was the mosquitoes. Each bunk had I feel like can't stop.
Yeah.
The only downer was the mosquitoes. Each bunk had a mosquito net, and when it turned dark, they were needed as the mosquitoes came in hordes. The ship service was first-rate, and many of us ate a lot of our meals there. Liberty passes were non-existent during this period, as I recall. So most of our social activities in and around the barracks. Many big poker games were a constant. Lots of money changed hands, as the crews going home had just been paid, and those of us going west had no apparent need for money in the islands. These games often would continue on through the wee hours of the morning, activity moving to the head after lights out. It often got noisy outside at night around our barracks as people sat around and talking and smoking by a pool adjacent. Lots of money changed hands as the crews going home had just been paid, and those of us going west had no apparent need for money in the islands. These games often would continue on through the wee hours of the morning, activity moving to the head after lights out. It often got noisy outside at night around our barracks as people sat around talking and smoking by a pool adjacent to ours. A humorous incident relative to these bull sessions. One evening, Gil Gilliland of Crew 4, who really liked his sack time, lost his patience with all the chatter, so he stepped out on the balcony to say a few choice words about the noise level, and obviously a few choice words came back. He calmly walked back inside, filled his mouth with lighter fluid, stepped back to the balcony, and sprayed it at a lighted match, sending a fireball toward the pool. He then ambled back to his bunk amidst a surprised silence. The pool was very, very quiet most evenings after that. There was, to my recollection, a beer joint just outside the gate to the base. They made good hamburgers, and in the evening we could walk through the gate, make a purchase, and walk back without Liberty cards. Illegal but overlooked by the gate guards. There was quite a baseball team at the base. The various branches of the military fought each other over gaining access to the big-name sports figures who were drafted or enlisted. For example, the first baseman on the Kaneohe team was Johnny Mize of the then New York Giants. Flight activity. Flights are hampered again by low daily availability of aircraft. Guns and armor had to be reinstalled, and more discouraging, the new type cylinders for which all aircraft had been exchanged purposely at Harvey Point were now considered outdated. Thus it became necessary to replace cylinders on all 15 planes with a type having the new sweated-in exhaust valve seats. On July 6, we flew our first patrol, a 700-mile sector flown northwest from Kaneohe in a pie-shaped wedge. The 700-mile sector would be 700 miles out, 75 across, and 700 back. During our stay at Kaneohe, the squadron patrol schedule was 2 daily patrols of 12 to 12 and a half hours duration. Most of these were uneventful except for sightings of other friendly planes and lots of our ships. Enemy activity was pretty much west and north of the Marshall Islands now. We also made familiarization flights around the other Hawaiian islands. I remember flying by Molokai and someone on the intercom said, "That's where the leper colony is. It's off limits to everyone, but a few priests who work there." This was before there was any treatment or real concern to fight that horrible disease. Lepers were put in completely isolated locations to die alone. Most of the crews flew to Hilo for a day's liberty. When we got our liberty flight, we enjoyed a few beers and entertainment in a local bistro. I mentioned earlier that we heard a popular song in this unique little club that was entitled "Charlotte the Harlot, the Queen of the Whores." That name we decided should be on the name of our plane, and later we flew with a nice nude, buxom brunette Charlotte, painted on the bow, courtesy of an Army sergeant who did the artwork for $10. We practiced fighter evasion tactics and gun camera gunnery with fighter planes from carrier air groups training in the area. We did a fair amount of air-to-air gunnery practice with tow target sleeves. There was also a gunnery range set up on one of the local cliffs, and we would fire from there at targets towed out over the water. Practice torpedo drops were made on ships underway off Pearl Harbor. I thought then what a thrill it would be to be making a torpedo run on a Japanese ship at 120 miles an hour, flying straight and level. Later, several of the crews did that at Okinawa, and all survived, though one was badly shot up. Torpedoes were dropped from racks under the wings of the PBMs. Once in the water, they traveled just like torpedoes shot from ships. On the 16th of July, Crew 7, with Ed Newkirk flying as PPC, located 2 survivors of the crash of an SB-2C dive bomber. While he circled the area sending contact information, a PBY-5A Dumbo arrived and made an open sea landing, as Crew 7 served as interested spectators. Unfortunately, the PBY made a bad landing and stove in its bow. Heavily damaged, there was no way to stay afloat, and the PBY quickly disappeared beneath the waves. Fortunately, all of the crew escaped. Now the PBY crew and the 2 SB-2C survivors were in rafts in the water. Crew 7 contacted and homed in a destroyer that was in the area, who effected the rescue of all the downed airmen. Newkirk, now short on fuel, had to head for home, so could not remain on station. Later word was received confirming that everyone in both planes had been rescued successfully. On July 23rd, alerted by a report from a search plane that enemy ships were approaching Hawaii, all crews were awakened at 0100 and told to prepare for patrols. 3 planes were immediately fueled and armed, and at 0300 took off to assist in searching for the supposed enemy task force. When the planes reached the reported area of the sighting, it proved to be erroneous. The enemy task force turned out to be a friendly convoy, a good example of how poor some surveillance and communication was during the war. The squadron and the crews, 1, 4, and 12, who conducted the patrols, were commended for their rapid response and accurate identification of the ships. There was a real plus to all this much ado about nothing. It was a positive sign that the squadron was well trained, very much on the ball, and obviously well prepared to move west into the combat zone. More ASW training. For 10 days in July, the squadron underwent their second ASW training program. These exercises employed a new and more practical approach to the subject, fitting its curriculum in each instance to the background and needs of the particular squadron and emphasizing actual flight training rather than mere theory. This pro-submarine exercise, in which individual aircraft coordinated attacks on supposedly enemy convoys, with squadron officers running the exercises under the guidance of experienced ASW instructors, was of great value. This was invaluable training because it was realistic, not just classroom theory. Some of the pilots and crews considered it superfluous, as they had been through ASW programs before, and some had actually been chasing German submarines in the Atlantic before joining VP-21. But as boring as it may have seemed to some, practice makes perfect, and this training paid dividends later, as evidenced by the squadron's ASW successes. Real sailors. Regular patrol routine continued all month with only one really scary incident. On August 13th, Crew 10, while 380 miles from Oahu, had a frightening experience and showed real skills and ingenuity when, with no warning, their port engine quit completely. To compound the situation, the throttle on the starboard engine happened to choose that exact moment to stick at a power setting that was inadequate to keep the plane airborne. Jim Young, in spite of these problems, made a good approach and effected a very nice landing on the relatively smooth sea. But as he touched down with no control of the starboard engine, the port wingtip float dug into the water and was ripped from the wing. Fortunately, quick action by 5 of the crew members prevented real disaster. They immediately climbed out onto the end of the starboard wing, and that held it down, thus making it possible to keep the plane afloat on a relatively even keel. This quick reaction was credited with saving the plane from capsizing and sinking. After a short period of time, a destroyer that was underway in the area, having heard the plane's SOS, arrived and took the disabled plane under tow. For the next 4 days, Crew 10, seasick and uncomfortable in their 80-foot boat, earned their sea pay as they rode the seas at the end of a tow line. Although not moving at high speed at the end of the tow line, the plane was porpoising off and on, and that made for an uncomfortable ride. The crew set up a routine that had 4 or 5 crew members stationed on the wing around the clock. Thus, they shared ballast duty to keep the plane afloat on a relatively even keel, while the destroyer acting as a tugboat towed the plane safely into Port Allen, Kauai. But even though the plane had been saved, it was going to require a major overhaul. It had taken quite a beating. Several of the crew talked of hearing grinding sounds from the stresses on the plane as it rode the waves, which was scary to say the least, but once again proved what a tough plane the PBM was. Because the damage was so severe, the plane had to be exchanged for another. This to ensure that the squadron would be at its full strength of 15 planes for the upcoming move west into the combat zone, planned for August 19th. Food and flying, a bad mix. As beautiful as I thought Kaneohe was, the flying was often quite rough, I guess due to the varying winds across the island and the bay. You really could be bounced around, and the tail turret seemed to bear a lot of the brunt, as it was out there all by itself. My only bout of air sickness while flying in the Navy occurred when we were flying a mine-laying practice hop, and I was stationed at the tunnel hatch taking pictures with a K-20 aerial camera. It was a clear but quite hot day, and the air was very bumpy. This exercise requires some real precision, as mines have to be laid in patterns. You fly low and drop each one on a time basis. With my head in the tunnel hatch riding backwards, I was trying to maintain my balance, take pictures, and keep my lunch down all at the same time. It didn't work, and I sprayed the tunnel with my meal. I did somehow get some good pictures, even though Joe Dirta wanted to know why the tunnel compartment of the camera smelled so shitty. There was another funny food incident on one of our patrols in August. Our flight rations that particular day included pork chops, and I was the designated chef. So there I was in the galley cooking the chops and producing a fair amount of smoke when I got a call from Leo Early and Joe Dirta inquiring, "What the hell's going on down there? We can't see it to fly this thing for all the smoke up here." I quickly got the chops off the stove. Actually, the meal turned out to be pretty good, and in the final analysis, browned to perfection. I got several compliments to the chef. Survival training. Another training program we went through was in survival techniques, basically indoctrination in the use of the plane's survival equipment, life rafts, emergency food and water supplies, flares, very pistol, shark repellent, which never worked very well as some of the crews would soon learn, and the Gibson Girl, an emergency radio transmitter. But we learned the hard way about some of the more practical aspects of preparing for being down at sea, such as hats, proper clothing, and constant attention to maintenance of life jackets and life rafts. On to the war. After months of fairly concentrated training, I think most of us were getting itchy, and morale had slipped a bit, probably being housed with guys who were coming back from the real war, and hearing some of their stories added to this impatience. It was apparent that we were getting ready to deploy when our mail became a bit slower arriving, and all we sent out was censored. In reality, and taking everything into consideration, they handled the mail quite well, considering the distances and constant moving of our bases. I had set up a code for various locations before I left for overseas, but it never worked. Actually, it made no difference, as my father had a cousin, a commander in the Navy Department, and he had access to unit locations, so he kept my parents informed as to my whereabouts. Another indication that we were getting ready to leave was when we repacked parachutes, got new flight suits, were issued sidearms, Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolvers, and got the plane on the compass rose for final calibration, and also did a thorough bore sighting job on all the guns. Then we had a big squadron party with lots of beer and food and a floor show featuring some great hula dancers. It was quite an affair and enjoyed by all of us. So now we knew for sure that we would be leaving. Just prior to the departure from Kaneohe, 2 new pilots, Lieutenant J.G. Fred Dickey and Ensign Lee Orsak, joined the squadron. Lee eventually ended up in Crew 14. He related a very funny story about an incident prior to his joining. He related a funny story about an incident prior to his joining VP-21. I was wandering around the South Pacific trying to get assigned to any squadron. And while I was on Guadalcanal, I was staying in a BOQ that consisted of about 50 cots in a Quonset hut with screening about 2 feet high on the side, and on each end a screen door that opened to the inside only. Just outside were air raid bunkers made out of coconut logs, always half filled with water, frogs, snakes, and other creatures. I had a cot in the middle of the hut just opposite one of the bunkers. This particular night, Washing Machine Charlie, which is a Japanese nuisance bomber, came over. The old-timer said he hadn't dropped anything for the last 3 months. He only comes as a nuisance. Just about that time, a gust of wind came up and about 6 coconuts hit the hut's tin roof. I thought, this is it, and crashed through the screen door to my cot, right on into the bunker filled with water and slimy creatures. Didn't get bit. Next day, all of us were busy replacing screening and repairing doors. During the fast exit, no one had bothered to open them. They were just bulldozed through. Several days later, I got my orders to report to VP-21. More Cumshaw. On the day we were leaving Kaneohe, Norm Lorenzen and Vince Walker, Crew 1, had an interesting experience. It seems that Vince was waiting in the plane on the ramp for Norm so they could get underway for Johnston Island. Suddenly the base OOD, Officer of the Day, and 2 other officers appeared and asked Vince if he knew anything about a missing Cushman motor scooter and a bicycle belonging to the air station. Vince, in all his innocence, said, "Why is he asking me?" Just at that instant, when he felt compelled to respond, Norm arrived. Vince told him what the OOD wanted. The OOD advised Norm that they wanted to inspect the plane. They did, and they found the scooter but not the bike, which later proved to be there also. They informed Norm that what had been done was very serious and ordinarily would result in further action, but in view of the circumstances, no further action would be taken. Neither Norm nor Vince had known that the scooter and bike were aboard, but after arriving in Eniwetok, it was nice for Crew 1 to have their own bike. Crew 1 had some clever Cumshaw operators, but not always 100% successful.